I'm Richard Pyatt. Welcome to the Little Blinking Light podcast. We're back again and will be several times talking about technology concerns and solutions that are important to you. Today, Roger Furwarn is back with us, president at AE Tech Design. Welcome back, Roger.
Well, welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you. Today, we're talking about open source software. What is it and why would an organization want it?
So open source software has had several different thoughts around it. A lot of times people think of open source software as free software. And there's some truth to that, but it's not so simple. It's not so straightforward as just free software. Open source software is software where the development platform is open. The code platform, everything that has been put into it is opened up to the general public. Anybody can see it. They can actually take it and kind of build something on top of it. But the most important thing is that they can contribute, view it, and know what's involved in the software. And oftentimes this provides a lot of great things for us. Most people don't realize a good portion of the internet is run on open source software to at least some degree. So especially a lot of the big infrastructure pieces are open source software, and people don't realize just how much goes into some of those projects and how big some of the corporate sponsors of some of those projects are, but they're still open source.
Can you give us a couple or even one example of an open source software someone might use more readily?
So I think I'm going to break that down in kind of two different buckets for you. A common use, let's say on the internet, for example, is a service called DNS. And the concept for DNS is you want to go to www.google.com. Your computer actually doesn't know how to directly get there. It knows how to get to something called an IP address, which is a series of numbers. A DNS server's most basic job is to take google.com and convert it into numbers that your computer and therefore across the internet can get to. And it's the translation software. So the big package on that is a piece of software called Bind. Bind was created at Berkeley, and it was a piece of software that has been used for 30 plus years for resolving DNS names to those IP addresses so that people can use those across the internet.
Okay. So is it safe?
I think that's an interesting question. And just like any other piece of software, there's a spectrum to that. However, we have found if you look at closed source commercial software and open source software, there is sometimes a correlation between those two things where open source software has some of the better track record from a security perspective than closed source software. And the reason for that is everybody can see the code, and then other people can contribute and go, hey, there's a bug here that's going to cause a security vulnerability. You need to patch that and get that fixed. So from a security perspective, sometimes it is actually more advantageous to use open source software than closed source software.
Wow.
However, with that being said, there are open source software projects out there that you have to make sure that you know the reputation of those and do the back end due diligence to make sure that you understand, are these ones that are going to have some security vulnerabilities? Have they had them in the past? Have they had more than they should? Have they taken a long time to patch them? Is the project even, still being developed? That's another thing. Unfortunately, sometimes it's just a passion project of somebody or a couple of people. The projects kind of fall by the wayside.
Sure.
Life happens. These individuals, if they're not making a whole lot of money from the project, they got to make their money somehow. And so they sometimes just let it fall to the wayside. But if you're using one of those projects in your organization, sometimes that can be detrimental. So you really have to know the reputation of the software that you're using, but that's true on the closed source software side too. So
That's very true. There's a level of trust either way.
there is.
I think that we are so conditioned now to be vigilant about security, right? So a lot of us approach anything really that has to do with this kind of technology and say, okay, are there any concerns that we should have about it? So I think what you're saying is in the open source situations, very often there's a collaborative spirit going on about the effectiveness of it.
There is a very much a general concern for security amongst the open source community. And there is a collaborative spirit of making the best possible software with the resources they have. And so not all open source software projects are as good as other ones about, the products they put out, how much polish is on them, how good the documentation is. But many, many today, I would say, rival commercial counterparts, if not exceed them. And they're starting to become commercially viable themselves. One of the big things about open source software is, again, that preconceived notion, it's free.
Yeah.
Well, it is free, but if your organization is relying on open source software to run, oftentimes it's advantageous to actually purchase the commercial support that many of these projects offer. And because of that, there is a big push to have people look at support packages that are going to provide them the same kind of support they would get with their commercial counterparts. The license for the software may be free, but the actual support isn't. And that's how these projects continue to function and do well and grow. And so from our standpoint at AE Tech Design, we want to make sure that these projects continue to flourish. But the other thing is it provides that level of support to make sure that you can trust it in your organization, so that when you're counting on it, when something goes down, that you're going to get a resolution quickly, and it's going to fix that in the long term, not just a short-term Band-Aid.
Right.
And oftentimes we've worked with open source software projects that are so good that the actual developers will get involved in the problem and actually write a patch that day, that week, whatever the case is, to make the problem go away. They're far more, again, collaborative. They're very open about how they do things. So,
well, it's advantageous to them to make sure it works right.
It is advantageous to them. But again, a lot of them are doing it more from a passion for what they're producing than just from trying to make a simple dollar from their project. So
I presume too that this is part of what you offer when you're working with a client, is to pass judgment on these kinds of open source options.
Absolutely. We work with all sorts of different organizations, and we've walked into many where they're using open source software, and we think that's great. But again, sometimes, for example, they don't patch it. So when we talk about security concern, great, you're using open source software. There's been, 4 years of patches that you haven't applied. There may be some problems with continuing to use it that way. Or we walk in and we find something, for example, maybe their server virtualization environment, maybe that's open source, but they haven't paid for support along the way. This is something that runs potentially every server in their environment.
Yeah.
And if something breaks and they don't know how to fix it, guess what? They don't have any support. So those are the types of things that we evaluate. We make sure that, there's good reputation for the software that's being used, whether it is open source or closed source. But we then also take it a step further and make sure everything's kind of up to snuff from a security standpoint, because the infrastructure and how it's put together and how it interacts with all the parts and pieces is what gives hackers such an easy open door sometimes.
Sure.
And if you actually look at a lot of the breaches of organizations, it's simple things that can be looked at from the start. And it's things like, hey, have you patched all of your software? Yes or no? I can't tell you how many places that I walk into and they haven't patched things for years. And oftentimes it's because they're afraid. They're afraid to patch it because it may break. Well, part of that fear is they don't have somebody to help them if that happens.
Yeah.
And, that's one of the things we like to make sure that we're available to help our clients. But we also make sure that the people that are actually producing the products that they're using are available to help our clients as well.
Well, I can understand that completely, because if you're someone who does not have this background, but you rely on this technology, it's almost like being afraid to push a button. You don't know what's going to happen,
right.
So we'll just leave it alone.
Right. And that's one of those things where it's like, well, you're relying on this technology, so you're afraid to patch it. and they're creating their own vicious cycle. So they're afraid to patch it because it might break, but because they're not patching it, it might break just the same. And it may break even more spectacularly, or may give an opportunity for somebody to do something in their environment that they don't want to have happen.
Yeah. All right. So these are the kinds of questions that AE Tech Design asks and evaluates when you meet someone, and you're really doing perhaps a performance check on the whole system, but this comes into play.
And that's exactly it. As a matter of fact, we won't take on clients that we don't get involved at the very bottom levels all the way to the top as far as how their technology is put together. We can't, because it becomes a liability for us if we don't understand what's happening inside of their environment. So we get involved in the nitty gritty so that we can be confident that things were put together in a way that their environment is secure, that their environment is well supported, and it will continue to function with a good level of reliability. And it's easy to maintain and support, because those are things that oftentimes don't happen. Is they don't know how to maintain them, and then when something breaks, they don't know what to do. It's panic in the streets, and It shouldn't be. It should be one of those things. Oh, it's broken. We have a contract with that vendor for 1 hour turnaround time on getting a resolution started on the problem. We'll be up and running within the next however many minutes, hours, whatever the case is. But when you know what you have and you know how to access it, that's a completely different scenario than just going, oh, we hope nothing happens. It's like sticking your head in the sand and just hoping for the best.
Yeah, It's a little scary.
It is.
All right. So whether you have questions about open source or maybe your whole setup, this is part of what Roger and his team at AE Tech Design handle, and part of what we'll be talking about in these episodes, various aspects like open source software. But if you have questions about that or anything else, right in the show notes is the link for AE Tech Design. Just click through, and Roger and his team are ready to answer questions and help you consider and evaluate your whole process. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it.
We'll be back soon with more Little Blinking Light podcast.